The night had settled upon the empty highway like a heavy shroud, its darkness pierced only by the occasional flicker of distant headlights. Laura, gripping the wheel of her aging sedan, exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The trip home was supposed to be uneventful, a simple drive through familiar roads to visit her parents in the quiet town where she had spent her childhood. But the gnawing unease in her stomach told her otherwise. Low on fuel, she pulled into a gas station that seemed abandoned by time itself. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. A single convenience store stood beside the pumps, its windows reflecting the dim glow of the neon open sign. The place felt wrong, but she had no choice. As she stepped out of her car, the silence was oppressive. No attendants, no customers, just the wind whispering through the trees beyond the lot. She inserted the nozzle into the tank, the click of the pump echoing in the emptiness. Then she noticed him. A man, leaning casually against the passenger side of her car. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Tall and unnaturally still, he watched her with an expression that teetered between curiosity and amusement. His clothing was nondescript, a dark jacket, jeans, and boots worn from use. But there was something unsettling in the way he smiled. It was too wide, as if he had practiced it in a mirror and gotten it wrong. "You traveling alone?" His voice was smooth, too friendly for the isolation of the night. Laura forced a polite smile, gripping the pump handle tighter. "Just passing through." He nodded, eyes never leaving her. "Nice car. You headed far?" Her pulse quickened. The question was innocent, yet the weight of it pressed down on her like an unseen force. She feigned indifference. "Just visiting family." The pump clicked, signaling a full tank. Laura's hands trembled as she replaced the nozzle. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get back inside the car, but she willed herself to move at a steady pace. She had learned, from whispered warnings and true crime stories, that sudden movements could trigger something in the wrong kind of person. "Drive safe," the man said, his grin never faltering. She muttered a thanks, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors in one swift motion. Her hands shook as she turned the key. The engine roared to life. She risked a glance in the mirror. He was still standing there, watching, smiling. Laura sped out of the station, her heart hammering against her ribs. The highway stretched before her, empty save for the rhythmic flash of white lines under her headlights. Her breathing slowed, but the tension in her chest refused to fade. Then, in the rearview mirror, twin beams of light appeared. A car. Her stomach twisted. It was him. The dark shape of his vehicle loomed behind her, maintaining an unnerving distance. Never too close, but never too far. Then, the headlights surged forward. A jolt of panic shot through her as he swerved toward her lane. The game had begun. The night air inside Laura's car was thick with her own breath, each exhale quick and uneven. The headlights in her rearview mirror bore down like the eyes of some relentless predator, unwavering and patient. The man's vehicle loomed behind her, toying with the space between them, sometimes creeping closer, sometimes falling back, like a cat playing with its prey. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt swallowed by darkness. No other cars, no exits, no sign of help. Then, the first attack came. The man's car accelerated without warning, surging toward her bumper with terrifying speed. Laura's pulse spiked as she veered to the side, narrowly avoiding impact. The tires screeched against the pavement. He wasn't just following her. He was trying to force her off the road. The game had escalated. Desperate, her eyes darted across the road signs, searching for anything that could lead her to safety. That's when she saw it. A lone building in the distance, its yellow sign glowing dimly. Diner. Open 24 hours. With one last glance at her pursuer, She yanked the wheel and took the exit, the car groaning in protest as she sped toward the small parking lot. The diner was old, worn down, but the neon flickered, a silent promise of refuge. She slammed the brakes and threw the door open, sprinting inside without looking back. The bell above the door jingled as she stumbled into the warm, greasy air of the diner. A waitress and an older man behind the counter turned to look at her, startled by her entrance. "There's a man," she panted, chest heaving. "He was following me. He tried to run me off the road." The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, exchanged a glance with the cook. "Sit down, honey. You're safe here. I'll call someone." Laura nodded, swallowing down the lump in her throat, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The parking lot was empty. The man's car was gone. Her stomach twisted. He had been right behind her. There was no way he could have turned around that quickly. No tire marks, no sound of an engine speeding away, just stillness. The waitress placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. "Don't worry. Some guys just get kicks out of scaring young women on the road." Laura nodded absently, forcing herself to breathe. Maybe he had just wanted to frighten her. Maybe it was over. She was about to take a sip when she noticed something. The side window of her car, visible through the diner's glass facade, had something stuck to it. A piece of paper. Her pulse pounded as she stood on shaky legs and walked toward the door, the cold air biting against her skin as she stepped into the empty parking lot. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The note was taped to her rear window. Hands trembling, she peeled it away and unfolded it. 3 words, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "See you soon." The wind howled through the night. And for the first time, Laura understood. This nightmare wasn't over. But she survived to tell this story. Thomas Lancaster had never been particularly social. His life was one of quiet routines, the kind that made time slip by unnoticed. Work, dinner, a book, and sleep. Living in an apartment on the 10th floor of an old but well-maintained building in the heart of the city, he had come to appreciate the anonymity that urban life provided. That evening, as he stepped out of the elevator and walked down the dimly lit hallway, he noticed something unusual. The apartment next to his, 9B, had its door slightly ajar. For as long as he had lived there, 9B had been vacant, a perpetually darkened doorway, a silent reminder of space unused. But now, faint light spilled into the hallway, casting elongated shadows against the cracked paint of the corridor walls. A man stood there, tall and thin, holding a stack of moving boxes, his head turned sharply as Thomas approached. "Oh, hey," the man said, his voice oddly warm. "You must be my neighbor." Thomas hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I live in 9A, welcome." The stranger smiled, but there was something disconcerting about it. Too wide, too rehearsed, like someone who had practiced human expressions in a mirror. His eyes were a pale, almost colorless gray, and though his features were sharp, they lacked something natural. "Glad to be here," the man said, adjusting the weight of his boxes. "Name's Adam. Just moved in today." Thomas nodded again, shifting uncomfortably. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Well, I hope you settle in well." Adam tilted his head slightly. "You live alone, right?" The question struck Thomas as strange, a little too forward for a first conversation. "Yeah," he admitted, wary of why that mattered. Adam's smile widened. "That must be nice. No one to misplace your things. No one to accidentally lock you out." Thomas frowned. "I guess." Adam chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Ever lost your keys? Or—" He paused, considering his next words. "Ever had them go missing?" A chill crept up Thomas's spine. He forced a polite smile and took a step back toward his door. "Not really. Anyway, have a good night." He turned the key in his lock, stepped inside, and shut the door firmly behind him. That should have been the end of it. But later that night, just as Thomas was drifting into sleep, he heard it. A noise outside his apartment. At first it was soft, just the faintest hint of movement. The kind of sound that could be dismissed as old pipes settling or the wind shifting through unseen cracks in the building. Then, it became unmistakable. Footsteps, not in the hallway, but directly in front of his door. Thomas sat up in bed, his breath caught in his throat. There was a pause, then the subtle jingle of metal. Keys. Someone was testing his lock. Heart hammering, he swung his legs over the bed and crept toward the door, careful not to make a sound. He pressed his eye against the peephole, peering into the dimly lit corridor. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Still, the sound continued. The faintest click and scrape, like someone trying different keys, searching for the one that would fit. Thomas's hand hovered over the doorknob, his pulse in his ears. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Silence. For a long time, he stood there, barely breathing, listening, but there was nothing more. Finally, he exhaled and shook his head. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe someone had passed by and accidentally brushed against his door. Maybe. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, when Thomas opened his door to leave for work, he froze. Deep, jagged scratches marred the surface of the wood, right where the lock was. They hadn't been there before. And though he told himself it could have been anything, someone moving furniture, a careless maintenance worker, deep inside he knew someone had been trying to get in. Someone who knew he lived alone. And the worst part? He had the sickening feeling they hadn't gone far. The scratches haunted Thomas for the rest of the day. At work, he found himself staring blankly at his computer screen, unable to focus. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the deep, jagged marks on his door, the silent proof that someone had been there, trying to get in, trying to reach him. By the time he arrived back at his apartment building that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on his body, but the unease in his mind kept him alert. As he stepped off the elevator, his heart sank. Adam was standing in front of his apartment. Not his own door, Thomas's. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, his pale eyes fixed on the scratches, as if studying them. Thomas swallowed hard and forced his voice to sound casual. "Hey." Adam turned his head slowly, his lips curling into that too-perfect smile. "Oh, Thomas." He paused. "We're on a first-name basis now, right?" Thomas didn't respond. He walked toward his door, glancing at Adam's expression, pleasant, relaxed, but with something unreadable beneath it. Adam gestured toward the scratches. "Rough neighborhood?" Thomas exhaled through his nose. "Something like that." Adam tilted his head, considering. Strange, though. Who would do such a thing? Thomas hesitated. Was he imagining the amusement in Adam's tone? The way his fingers rested just a little too long on the scratched wood. "I don't know," Thomas said. "Building security is looking into it." Adam's smile flickered just for a second. A crack in the mask. Then, just as quickly, he nodded. "That's good. Gotta keep things safe." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Thomas reached for his key. "Well, I need to—" "Oh, before you go," Adam interrupted, his tone light, almost playful. "Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and felt like someone was in the room with you?" Thomas's hand froze on the doorknob. "I read about that once," Adam continued, as if discussing the weather. "Your body paralyzed, shadows shifting in the dark, the feeling of someone standing right beside your bed." Thomas clenched his jaw. "Yeah, I've heard of that." Adam's grin widened. "Let's hope you never experience it." With that, he turned and walked into his own apartment, the door closing with a soft click. Thomas stepped inside his own unit and locked the door behind him. Twice. He didn't sleep well that night. The next evening, something changed. Thomas arrived home late, worn from another restless night and a full day of work. He stepped into the hallway, gripping his keys. when something made his stomach drop. His door was open. Just a crack. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to call someone, but his feet moved forward anyway. He nudged the door wider. The apartment was dark, silent. Nothing seemed out of place. But as he stepped inside, a draft curled around him, a whisper of air from somewhere deep within. The door shut softly behind him. He turned on the light. Everything looked normal: his couch, his bookshelf, his desk. But something felt wrong. A presence, unseen but unmistakable. His eyes swept the room. Then they landed on the bedroom door. It was open. It hadn't been open when he left that morning. A slow, cold dread spread through his chest. He moved cautiously toward the bedroom, his breath shallow. He reached the doorway, flicked on the light. Empty. The bed was undisturbed. The window was closed. Nothing looked unusual. But then he saw it. A single object, placed neatly in the center of his pillow. A key. Not his. Not from his apartment. His stomach twisted. Someone had been here, and they had left him a message.
I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's not that I don't want to help. I do. But I've heard enough horror stories to know better. Late at night, on a deserted highway, the safest thing to do is keep driving. But that night, something made me stop. Maybe it was the rain, hammering against the windshield so hard my wipers could barely keep up. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another person for miles, just the endless stretch of wet asphalt vanishing into the mist. Or maybe it was because he just looked so lost. I spotted him just outside the glare of my headlights, a dark shape against the rain-soaked road. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his body, his posture rigid as he raised an arm and signaled for help. I should have kept driving. Instead, I slowed down. As I pulled over, my tires splashing through a shallow puddle, he hesitated for a second before stepping toward the passenger side. Up close, he looked even worse. His face pale, his eyes sunken and dark, his lips slightly parted like he'd just run a marathon. I reached over and unlocked the door. Big mistake. He slid into the seat without a word. A sharp gust of cold air followed him inside, and for a moment, I felt an odd pressure in my ears, like the air had been sucked out of the car. Thanks, he muttered finally, his voice hoarse. No problem, I replied, pulling back onto the road. Bad night to be out walking. He exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. You have no idea. The way he said it sent a small shiver down my spine. We drove in silence for a while. The rain kept falling, drumming steadily against the roof. My headlights cut through the thick mist, revealing nothing but empty road ahead. I stole a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his hands resting stiffly on his knees. You heading somewhere specific? I asked, trying to break the tension. He hesitated. Then, another pause. Home. Something about the way he said it made my grip tighten on the wheel. The way he dragged out the word, like he wasn't quite sure what it meant. I nodded slowly. Where's home? He turned his head toward me, just slightly. I was hoping you could tell me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my voice casual, though my pulse had started to quicken. He tilted his head slightly. This road. It feels familiar. I swallowed. You from around here? A long pause. Then, finally, I don't remember. Something about that answer made my stomach twist. We drove in silence for a few more miles. I kept my eyes on the road, but I could feel him watching me. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, Do you ever think about what happens to the ones who never make it home? I frowned. What? The ones who disappear. His voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. The ones you hear about on the news. The ones they never find. My hands tightened on the wheel. I try not to, I admitted. He nodded slowly. Yeah, most people don't. I was about to change the subject when he let out a small chuckle, low, almost to himself. What's funny? I asked, glancing at him. His lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. I was just thinking, he said, tilting his head slightly, how strange it is that you stopped for me, Cold knot formed in my stomach. What do you mean? He turned to face me fully now, his dark eyes unreadable. Would you have stopped if you knew where I was coming from? I opened my mouth, then hesitated. There was something about the way he asked that question. Like it wasn't just a hypothetical. Like there was a real answer. I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to pull over and let him out. But when I reached for the door lock, I realized it was already locked. And I hadn't locked it. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I hit the unlock button. Nothing. The locks didn't budge. My pulse pounded in my ears. I forced a nervous chuckle. Looks like the system's jammed, I muttered. The man just smiled. That's okay, he said softly. We're almost there. I turned to him sharply. We're almost where? His expression didn't change. You'll see. And then, he reached forward and switched off my headlights. Darkness swallowed the road. The silence in the car had grown unbearable. The only sounds were the wipers smearing rain across the windshield and the steady, rhythmic tap of my fingers against the steering wheel. I needed to get this man out of my car. He had barely spoken in the last 10 minutes, only staring straight ahead. I had stopped trying to make small talk. His presence had shifted from strange to downright unsettling, and every nerve in my body was screaming that something wasn't right. Cleared my throat. Where did you say you were headed again? He didn't answer right away. Then, without turning his head, he muttered, not far now. His voice was softer this time, almost thoughtful. My fingers clenched tighter on the wheel. That wasn't an answer. The highway was empty except for us, stretching endlessly into the wet darkness. The rain had let up slightly, but the road was still slick. The last thing I wanted was to hydroplane, especially with a stranger in the car. I glanced at the gas gauge, half a tank. No excuse to stop. No convenient way to pull over and say, sorry, ride's over. I had to think of something. Listen, I said, forcing a casual tone. I actually need to take an exit soon. Got somewhere to be early in the morning. For the first time in minutes, he moved. He turned his head slightly toward me, just enough for me to see the corner of his mouth twitch upward. You didn't mention that before. I forced a chuckle. Yeah, it just slipped my mind. He nodded slowly. Right? I swallowed hard. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. Then, out of nowhere, you live alone? My breath caught. I gripped the wheel tighter. What? His expression remained unreadable. I was just wondering. You live alone? A cold chill ran down my spine. Why the hell was he asking that? I forced out a short laugh. Nah, got a roommate. Big guy. Works in security. The lie tasted strange in my mouth, but I hoped it sounded convincing. The man was silent for a moment. Then he smiled just a little. Good, he murmured. That's good. I kept my eyes on the road, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Something was off. His body language, his questions, the way he hadn't even flinched when I'd lied. I had to get him out of my car. Now, up ahead, a green sign appeared through the mist. Rest area, 2 miles. Perfect. I straightened in my seat. Hey, I actually need to pull over for a second. The man didn't react. I forced a casual tone. Gotta check something on my phone. Still nothing. Then, just as the exit ramp came into view, his fingers slowly reached for the door handle. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. Not because he was leaving, but because of how calm he was about it. He knew. Somehow, he knew I was trying to get rid of him, and he wasn't surprised. I pulled into the rest stop parking lot, my hands slick against the wheel. The place was empty, except for a single flickering light post and an old vending machine buzzing near the restroom entrance. The rain drizzled lightly against the windshield. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, finally, he turned to me and said, "You should be more careful about who you let into your car." And with that, he opened the door and stepped out into the rain. I didn't wait. The second the door slammed shut, I threw the car into drive and sped off, my tires screeching against the wet pavement. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing motionless under the streetlight, watching me, just standing, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again, and I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I had dodged a bullet and that was that. But then, while scrolling through the news, a headline made my stomach drop. Man found dead near highway rest stop. Police seek information. I clicked the article, my breath catching. The description matched him. Same height, same dark hair, same worn-out gray hoodie. But the thing that made my blood run cold? The report said he had been dead for over a week before his body was discovered. Yet I had just given him a ride last night,